A pleasant day to those who are watching this. This is about the Philippine and African literature, and we are hoping that you will be satisfied on what you will learn and what you will see in this video. So back to ancient Egypt and hieroglyphs for thousands of years. That is when the African literature evolved.
In the African literature, they always use pictures to represent words or what they want to say. It also led to Arabic poetry in the 7th century.
And because of the Arabic and African culture, it became the reason on how the literature was created.
During the years in Africa, they experienced problems and struggles. And because of it, it became an influence on their literature. The one example of their struggle, it led to colonization.
Colonization means going to another country because your own country is overpopulated already. And because of this colonization, the inhabited island and the wealth itself are somehow destroyed by the incoming people from another country.
Colonization is also the reason why the African people became slaves. They were enslaved and taken to other parts of other countries to serve other people in other countries.
And there is what we call the African diaspora. It is a means of transportation so that the African people who will be a slave will be transported to other country via the Atlantic slave trade.
So after the African diaspora, in the ongoing of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the sub-Saharan Africa produced a written literature. So as a punishment for the consequences of that missionaries because they did come to that area.
So for the growth or development came about in order for them to understand the text, the missionaries that Dela Paz was talking about is that they decided to went to Africa to build churches and language schools to help the people there or their communities to translate the text. So it is the reason on how it was led to writing in both European and indigenous languages by Africans.
Chinua Achebe is one of the most admired authors and wrote some of the 20th century's most remarkable works. One of his most popular book, titled Things Fall Apart, it was wrote in 1958. It is about devastating the fiction of the clash between traditional values and the effects of colonial rules, as well as the friction in highly patriarchal cultures between masculinity and femininity.
Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, she was born in Nigeria in 1977, and her works of horror are mainly character-driven, interweaving into the background of the history of her native Nigeria and social and political events. A novel of purple hibiscus, and was published in 2003. It is about Tambili Achike, age 15 for much of the period covered by the book. A member of a wealthy family dominated by her devout Catholic father, Eugene. Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. This latest novel was published in the latest 2013, an informative portrayal of Nigerian immigrant life and racial relations in America and the Western world.
Ayikwe Arma. His novels are known for their intense and powerful depictions of political devastation and social frustration in Arma's native Ghana, told from the point of view of the individual. His works such as Jean Faustet and Albert Camus have been profoundly influenced by French existential philosophers, and as such have themes of desperation, disillusionment, and irrationality. One of his most popular books, titled The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, it was wrote on 1968. It is about the circumstances of post-independence. It focuses on unnamed protagonist who tries to understand his own self and his country.
Only because of its relevant setting and relatable plots is African literature not just significant, it also increases the civic consciousness of its citizens and raises knowledge of the issues, political and economic crises facing the African continent. Now let's talk about the Philippine literature. A nation rich in diversity and linguistic heritage. Interestingly, its literature had developed enormously long before Spanish colonization.
Do you know that some of the notable literature is a general representation of the Spaniards' influence during the Philippine colonization? In fact, there has been widespread evidence during pre-colonial times that the island's populations exhibits a culture rich with traditions.
They describe our ancestral lifestyle and way of living before. Their everyday life comprises folk songs, folk speeches, and indigenous rituals. The infusion of such elements demonstrates the profoundly ingrained lifestyles of the locals.
Also, an understanding of the history of literature in the Philippines will allow us to appreciate this nation's literary riches. Moreover, Spain's colonization did not bring a stop to the production of literature. Instead, the local literary works breathed a different kind of life into them, and through a religion and institutions, European civilizations was imbued by local custom.
Over that period, performing theaters were introduced, and enrichment was witnessed in local languages. Much later, Spain introduced modern ideas into the people of the Philippines and a sense of internationalism.
Fascinatingly, it has significant impact on local intellectual, comparable to the Renaissance times. In their works, they begin to challenge and portray the definitions of liberty and freedom. The history of Philippine literature shows that some of the literature is produced by QWERTY, the mixture of realism and surrealism.
As Filipino intellectuals educated in Europe wrote about the colonization and its related downsides, the 19th century marked a shift in academic development. This realization culminated in a Reformation movement that ultimately contributed to the Spanish colonial collapse.
In addition, when English was adopted, Philippine literature history was marked once by a transition. The English language introduction resulted in a gradual disappearance of Spanish, followed by literature published in Spanish.
Besides, some of the well-known English poetry, short stories, and once again, enriched local literature uniquely were born with the continuous use of English.
Tor Jose P. Rizal, the Philippine national hero, was also a prolific writer, poet, and essayist. The execution of Rizal at 35 years old set off the Philippine Revolution and paved the way for the country's independence.
Noli Me Tangere was written on 1887 and in Spanish. It centers around the mixed-race heir of a rich clan, Crisostomo Ibarra, returning home after 7 years in Europe, and packed with thoughts about how to make his countrymen's life a lot easier. Striving for change, he is met by an abusive ecclesiastical elite and becomes indifferent and brutal to the Spanish civil government.
El Filibusterismo. It was published on 1891. It was Jose Rizal's second and last book, completed and sequel to Noli Me Tangere. It still has one Crisostomo Ibarra as its protagonist, a grim, brooding, often sarcastic novel of retribution, unfulfilled passion and tragedy. 13 years older, his idealism, naive aspiration become crushed and he is dressed up as Simon, an immensely rich and enigmatic jeweler who acquired the trust of the governor-general of the colony, taking advantage of the illusion that he died at the end of Noli Me Tangere.
Francisco Balagtas, a popular Filipino poet during the Philippine-Spanish colonial era. Because of his influence on Filipino literature, he is generally considered one of the greatest Filipino literary laureates. Florante at Laura, a wit form where there are 4 lines and 12 syllables per line and per stanza. The plot between Duke Florante and Princess Laura, who is also pursued by the enemy, Count Adolfo of Florante, is addressed in the fictitious kingdom of Albania.
Nick Joaquin won the National Artist Award for Literature, most esteemed writer the Philippines has produced. He served as a journalist for several years, and his deeply intellectual writings raised the country's journalism's expectations.
The woman who had 2 novels, Connie Escobar, the main female character, claims she has 2 novels and therefore begs her doctor to cut one, which symbolically means she needs to shun a painful past. She later figures out that her mother's boyfriend was her husband, Macho Escobar. She flees only to find more truths, trying to survive despite being tricked.
It preserves many Filipino people, cultures, and custom, and acts as a legacy for the Philippines and for future generation as well. Many of contemporary Filipino society's issues, traits, and characteristics can be traced back to historical concerns regarding our colonial history, as well as our pre-colonial culture.
The group should compare Philippine literature and the literature assigned to them by highlighting the Philippine writing is the writing related to the Philippines and incorporates the legends of ancient times and the colonial biggest of the Philippines. Pre-Hispanic Philippine writing were really legends passed on from era to era, initially through verbal convention, whereas African writing. Scholarly works of the African landmass, African writing comprises a body of work in numerous dialects and different classes, extending from verbal writing to writing composed in colonial dialects. Similarities, differences in themes and approach. African literature themes. Themes of colonialism, freedom, patriotism, convention, uprooting, and ruthlessness in African literature. This paper bargains with a few of the subjects in African writing, such as colonialism, freedom, patriotism, convention, relocation, and the most themes of Philippine writing center of the countries, pre-colonial social conventions, and the socio-political histories of its colonial and modern traditions. For these similarities, differences. There are numerous similarities and reasons between Africa and the Philippines. The foremost common of the similarities is the solid colonial history or influence within the society. Usually, the impact of post-colonial philosophy. Africa had been colonized by European nations such as France, Portugal, United Kingdom, and others, whereas the Philippines had been colonized by Spain. United States of America and Japan, both of them had involvement in the laws in case their own character within the hands of conclusion. To end this, it can be seen that the literature reflects based on where it was written and for what it was written. Civilizations have been shaped, political institutions have been modified, and inequality rebuilt. Literature presents us with a concise description of human experiences, helping us to interact with profound levels of motivation and sentiment. It works as a representation of reality, a product of art, and a border to an ideology. We need to love the literature that our country.